The dim light of the morning sun filtered through the curtains as Clara stood by the window, her hand resting gently on her round belly. Her dog, Sol, lay at her feet, his warm, amber eyes watching her every move. To Clara, Sol was more than just a pet. He was family, her confidant, and her protector. Yet the storm brewing in her home was threatening to rip apart the fragile peace she cherished. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor. Isabel, her mother-in-law, entered the room with the authority of a queen inspecting her court. She carried a cup of tea, her expression as cold and calculating as ever. "Good morning, Clara," Isabel said, her voice laced with a sugary sweetness that felt anything but genuine. "How are we feeling today?" Still insistent on keeping that creature in the house, I see. Clara felt her heart sink, but she forced a polite smile. "Sol isn't just a dog, Isabel. He's been with me through everything, even before I met Alexander. He's family." Isabel raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a condescending smirk. "Family? My dear, let me remind you that the only family you should be concerned about now is the one growing inside you. A dog in the house with a baby on the way is irresponsible, to say the least." Before Clara could respond, Alexander entered the room, his tie askew and his hair slightly ruffled. He looked between his wife and mother, sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. "Mother, can we not do this today?" he asked, his voice weary. "Clara needs to rest." Isabel turned to her son, her eyes narrowing. "Rest? Alexander, your wife is endangering my grandchild's health by keeping that filthy animal here. Surely, you care about your child more than a dog." Clara's hand instinctively moved to her belly, a pang of guilt and frustration coursing through her. Alexander hesitated, torn between his mother's authoritative stance and his wife's quiet resilience. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said finally, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Sol hasn't caused any problems. Clara takes good care of him." Isabel scoffed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Mark my words, Alexander. If anything happens to that baby because of that animal, you'll only have yourselves to blame." With that, she turned and stormed out of the room, leaving an icy silence in her wake. Later that evening, as Clara prepared dinner, she couldn't shake the weight of Isabel's words. Sol followed her around the kitchen, his tail wagging gently. He nudged her leg with his nose, sensing her unease. "You're the only one who understands me, aren't you, boy?" Clara whispered, stroking Sol's head. The dog let out a soft whine as if in agreement. Just then, Alexander entered the kitchen, his face drawn with worry. "Clara," he began hesitantly, "maybe we should consider what my mother said. Just think about it for the baby's sake." Clara froze, her hand hovering over the cutting board. "You're asking me to get rid of Sol," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not saying that," Alexander said quickly. "I'm just saying we need to prioritize the baby's health. Maybe we could find someone to take care of Sol for a while, just until—" "Until what?" Clara interrupted, her eyes brimming with tears. "Until I give up a piece of myself? Until I prove to your mother that I'm not fit to make decisions for our family." Alexander looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The silence between them was deafening. That night, Clara lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts of her unborn child, her marriage, and the unyielding pressure from Isabel. Sol lay at her side, his head resting on her arm. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she didn't notice the way Sol's ears perked up or the low growl that rumbled in his throat. In the shadows of the hallway, a figure moved silently, the faint sound of a phone call echoing in the distance. The next morning, Clara awoke to find Sol sitting by the front door, his body tense and his gaze fixed on something outside. When she opened the door, she saw nothing unusual, just the empty street and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But Sol's behavior unnerved her. It was as if he sensed something she couldn't see, something just beyond the edges of her understanding. And in the quiet moments that followed, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her battle was only just beginning. The tension in the household grew heavier with each passing day. Clara could feel Isabel's disapproving gaze even when they weren't in the same room. The once warm atmosphere of the home now felt cold and oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. Saul, ever faithful, stayed close to Clara, his presence a source of comfort amidst the growing unease. Yet his behavior had changed. He was more alert, his ears constantly twitching at sounds no one else seemed to notice. One evening, as Clara stood in the nursery arranging baby clothes, she noticed Saul sitting in the doorway, his body stiff and his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. "Saul, what is it, boy?" she asked, walking over to him. The dog let out a low growl, his eyes unblinking. Clara followed his gaze, but the corner was empty save for the soft shadows cast by the dim light. "Maybe you're just imagining things," she murmured, stroking his fur. But deep down, an uneasy feeling began to take root. The next morning, Isabel called a family meeting. She sat at the head of the dining table, her posture rigid and her eyes sharp. Alexander and Clara sat across from her, with Saul lying obediently at Clara's feet. "I've given this matter a great deal of thought," Isabel began, her tone clipped. "And I've decided that if Clara refuses to get rid of that dog, I will no longer support this household." Clara's heart sank. Isabel had been financially supporting them ever since Alexander's business faced difficulties. Losing that support would put immense strain on them, especially with the baby on the way. "Mother, that's not fair," Alexander said, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't force us to make that decision." "I'm doing what's best for my grandchild," Isabel replied coldly. "And if you had any sense, you'd do the same." Clara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but the weight of Isabel's words left her feeling helpless. Later that night, Clara sat on the living room couch, her mind racing with thoughts of Isabel's ultimatum. Saul lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. The soft chime of her phone broke the silence. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Be careful. Not everything is as it seems." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her mind scrambling to make sense of it. Who had sent it? And what did it mean? Before she could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She quickly locked her phone and looked up to see Alexander entering the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing the tension in her expression. "I'm fine," Clara lied, forcing a smile, but the unease in her chest refused to subside. The next day, Clara decided to do some research about the message. She spent hours on her laptop, trying to trace the number and understand its origin, but her efforts yielded no answers. As she sat in her room, frustrated and exhausted, Felicity, the family's housekeeper, entered with a tray of tea. "Mrs. Clara, you look troubled," Felicity said kindly. Clara hesitated before speaking. "Felicity, have you noticed anything strange lately? Anything unusual?" Felicity's expression shifted, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. "Well, now that you mention it, there have been some odd occurrences. I've heard noises at night. Whispers, almost, and I've felt like someone's watching me, even when I'm alone." Clara's blood ran cold. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't want to worry you," Felicity replied. "But maybe it's time to pay attention to these things. Sometimes ignoring them only makes them worse." That evening, as Clara prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her paranoia growing with each passing moment. When she finally lay down, Saul jumped onto the bed, curling up beside her. His steady breathing was a small comfort amidst the storm of her thoughts. But as the night wore on, Clara was jolted awake by a sudden noise, a loud thud coming from the living room. Her heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and tiptoed down the hallway, Saul following closely behind. When she reached the living room, she froze. The coffee table had been overturned, and the vase that had been sitting on it lay shattered on the floor. "What on earth?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Saul began growling, his body tense and his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the room. Clara strained her ears, and for a brief moment she thought she heard it too, a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of reach. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. But the only response was silence. Clara quickly grabbed Sol's collar and backed out of the room, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She locked the bedroom door behind her and sat on the bed, clutching her phone. As she stared at the screen, another message appeared. "It's closer than you think." Clara's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she stared at the words, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. And in the corner of the room, unnoticed by Clara, Sol stared intently at the door, his growls growing louder. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, but it brought little comfort to Clara. She hadn't slept a wink, her mind replaying the events of the previous night, the overturned coffee table, the chilling whispers, and the cryptic message on her phone. Sol sat at her feet, his sharp eyes scanning the room as if he too were on edge. Clara Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts as he entered the room, a cup of tea in hand. "You look exhausted," he said, concern etched on his face. Clara hesitated, unsure if she should share what had happened. But the weight of secrecy was too much to bear. "Alex, something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "Last night I heard noises. Someone, or something, was in the house." Alexander frowned. "Did you call the police?" "No. I wasn't sure if they'd believe me." "There's no proof," Clara replied, holding her phone. "But I got another message." She showed him the text. "It's closer than you think." Alexander's expression darkened. "This is getting out of hand. I'll check the security cameras. Maybe they caught something." Alexander spent hours reviewing the footage from the night before. Clara sat beside him, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. "Here," Alexander said, pausing the video. The footage showed the living room around the time of the incident. At first, everything seemed normal. The room was quiet, the furniture undisturbed. But then a shadow moved across the frame, an amorphous, unidentifiable shape that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "What is that?" Clara whispered. "I don't know," Alexander replied, his voice low. "It doesn't look like a person, or an animal." As they watched, the shadow seemed to linger near the nursery before disappearing entirely. Later that day, Isabel arrived unannounced, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried an air of smugness that made Clara's stomach churn. "I've heard about the chaos," Isabel said, her tone sharp. "First the parasite and now strange occurrences in the house." "It's no coincidence, Clara. That dog of yours is the problem." Clara clenched her fists. "Sol has nothing to do with this." "Oh, really?" Isabel said, raising an eyebrow. "Dogs are sensitive creatures. They can sense things we can't. If he's acting strange, it's because something is wrong. And if you ask me, keeping him here is only making things worse." Alexander intervened, his patience wearing thin. "Mother, enough. We don't need your judgment right now." But Isabel wasn't deterred. "Mark my words, that dog is the source of your troubles. And if you don't get rid of him, don't come crying to me when things get worse." As night fell, Clara found herself in the kitchen with Felicity. The housekeeper had always been a comforting presence, but tonight even she seemed uneasy. "Mrs. Clara," Felicity began hesitantly, "there's something I think you should know." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Felicity glanced around as if afraid someone might overhear. "A long time ago, when this house was first built, there was a tragedy. The original owners lost their child under mysterious circumstances. Ever since, people have said the house is cursed." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I didn't want to scare you," Felicity admitted. "But with everything that's been happening, I think you need to be careful. Sometimes, the past has a way of creeping back into the present." That night, Clara lay awake, her thoughts consumed by Felicity's words. Sol lay at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching at every sound. Around midnight, a faint noise echoed through the house, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like the sound of a rocking chair. Clara's blood ran cold. The nursery had a rocking chair. She nudged Alexander awake. "Alex, do you hear that?" He groggily listened, his expression turning serious as the sound grew louder. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the flashlight. But Clara couldn't stay behind. She followed him down the hallway, Sol close on her heels. When they reached the nursery, the door was slightly ajar. Alexander pushed it open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rocking chair was moving on its own. Clara gasped, clutching Alexander's arm. "This can't be real." Suddenly, Sol began barking furiously, his growls echoing through the room. The chair stopped abruptly, and the temperature seemed to drop. Before they could react, the mobile hanging above the crib began to spin wildly, its soft tune distorted into something eerie and unsettling. Alexander grabbed Clara's hand. "We're leaving. Now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Clara screamed, her heart pounding as the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. And in the silence that followed, a voice whispered, "You can't escape." The door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through Clara's bones. Alexander pulled her out of the nursery, his grip firm and steady despite the fear in his eyes. As they stepped into the hallway, Clara looked back, half expecting to see the door close again, but the nursery was dark and silent. Sol whimpered at her feet, his eyes fixed on the closed door. "What was that?" Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Alexander replied, his eyes scanning the hallway. "But it wasn't just a random noise. This house, it's like it's alive." Clara's heart raced as they descended the stairs. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the eerie quiet of the house. "I think we should leave," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight, get out of here while we still can." As dawn broke, Clara and Alexander convened in the living room with Felicity and Isabel. The atmosphere was tense, the room heavy with unspoken fear. Clara started, her voice steady but uncertain. "We need to talk about what happened last night. I think it's time we—" Isabel cut her off, her expression hard. "You want to leave the house. That's not the answer, Clara. You need to deal with this, face it head on." "Deal with what?" Clara shot back, her frustration and fear bubbling over. "What are we dealing with, Isabel? This isn't just a problem, it's—" Felicity interrupted, her voice trembling. "It's connected to the past. The original owners of this house. They lost their child. Some say it was a spirit that took him, others believe it was something far darker." Isabel sneered. "Superstition. You really think a ghost is haunting us?" "No," Felicity said, shaking her head. "But there's something here, something that won't let go. And it's targeting Clara and Alexander because of their attachment to Sol." Clara felt a shiver run through her. "Attachment? You think this is about Sol?" "He's sensitive," Felicity replied, her eyes on the ground. "Animals often sense things we can't. Maybe he's trying to warn you." Isabel rolled her eyes. "Or maybe he's just a dog." Determined to get answers, Alexander insisted on bringing in a paranormal investigator. The house was no stranger to odd occurrences, and he wanted a professional opinion on what might be happening. After a few calls, Alexander secured an appointment with Dr. Lorraine, a specialist known for her expertise in the supernatural. "Dr. Lorraine is a friend of a friend," Alexander explained to Clara as they waited for the investigator to arrive. "She's worked on some pretty high-profile cases. If anyone can help us, it's her." The doorbell rang, and Alexander hurried to answer it. Dr. Lorraine stood in the doorway, her calm demeanor at odds with the supernatural rumors that surrounded her. "Please come in," Alexander said, stepping aside to let her in. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Clara said, offering Dr. Lorraine a seat. Dr. Lorraine settled into a chair, her eyes flicking around the room as if she were taking in the whole house at once. "Tell me what's been happening," she said in a low, soothing voice. Clara began her story, recounting the strange noises, the message on her phone, the shadow in the security footage, and the unsettling rocking chair in the nursery. Dr. Lorraine listened intently, occasionally nodding as if she were piecing together a puzzle. "Have you had any similar experiences before?" Dr. Lorraine asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "When I was a child, I used to hear things at night. Voices, footsteps in the hall. My parents thought I was imagining it." Dr. Lorraine's brow furrowed. "That's significant. Do you still remember what was said?" Clara shook her head. "I didn't understand then. It was just whispers in the dark." Dr. Lorraine's eyes widened as Clara spoke. "There's something here that's connected to you, Clara. It's not random. It's targeting you specifically. The past, it's bleeding into the present." "What does that mean?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. "It means there's unfinished business," Dr. Lorraine replied, her voice grave. "Something from your childhood, something you've repressed or forgotten. It's trying to reach you, and it's using your home as a conduit." Isabel scoffed. "This is crazy. Are you seriously suggesting we open up old wounds?" "It may be the only way to break this cycle," Dr. Lorraine said. "If there's a ghost or a spirit, they're not just haunting your house, they're haunting you, and if we can find out what it wants, we might be able to stop it." Clara felt a wave of fear mixed with determination. "What do we do?" "First, we need to find out what this entity wants," Dr. Lorraine replied, her voice steady. "That means looking into your past, your childhood, your family history. There's something hidden there, something we need to uncover." Alexander squeezed Clara's hand. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Clara nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. "What if it's too dangerous?" Dr. Lorraine leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "There's always a risk, but it's the only way to break free. Sometimes you have to confront your fears head-on to overcome them." Clara swallowed hard. I think I'm ready to go back." Later that day, Clara and Alexander began their search. They sifted through old family photo albums, read through dusty documents hidden away in drawers, and even visited the family archive at the local library. Isabel was more skeptical than ever, insisting that the answers couldn't be found in old photographs or musty records. "Sometimes the past is just that. Past," she said, her tone dismissive. "This is a waste of time." But Clara wouldn't be dissuaded. "There's something here, something I need to understand. I need to know why this is happening." Hours turned into days as they searched, each clue leading them deeper into a world of forgotten memories and dark secrets. It was a small, almost insignificant detail in a faded newspaper clipping that changed everything. Clara was tracing her family tree when she stumbled upon an obituary. A young boy named Thomas who had died under mysterious circumstances just weeks after the house was built. "Thomas," Clara whispered, her heart racing. "This is my great-grandfather." Dr. Lorraine leaned over, her eyes scanning the article. "He died here, in this house?" "Yes," Clara replied, her voice barely audible. "And no one knows how or why." "Maybe that's why it's targeting you," Dr. Lorraine said softly. "Because you're connected to him. There's a connection that goes beyond blood, something that's bound to this place." Dr. Lorraine proposed a seance, a risky but potentially revealing way to communicate with the spirits. "It's a last resort," she admitted, "but sometimes it's the only way to break through the veil between worlds." Isabel's eyes widened. "A seance? You're out of your mind, Lorraine." Dr. Lorraine held up her hands. "It's not a game, Isabel. Isn't about belief, it's about communication. We need to understand what's haunting this house, and sometimes that means making contact." Clara took a deep breath. "If it's the only way, then let's do it." Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her as she set up the living room for the seance. Alexander helped, carefully placing candles in a circle on the floor, while Dr. Lorraine arranged her crystals, and a small altar in the center. Isabel watched from the corner of the room, her arms crossed and a frown on her face. This is ridiculous, she muttered, glancing at her watch. Can we just get this over with? Isabel, this is serious, Alexander said, his voice calm but firm. It's the only way to find out what's going on. Or it could make things worse, Isabel shot back. You're playing with things you don't understand. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she picked up the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of wood they would use to communicate. We're doing this, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the circle of candles. And we're doing it together. Dr. Lorraine joined them, her expression focused. Remember, this isn't a game. We're calling for guidance, not to entertain. Alexander nodded, his hand resting on Clara's. Let's do this. As they held hands and closed their eyes, the room seemed to grow colder. The candles in the circle flickered once, twice, before settling into a steady rhythm. Dr. Lorraine began to chant softly, in a language Clara didn't recognize, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. Isabel shifted nervously on the couch, her gaze darting from face to face as if searching for signs of weakness. This is insane, she muttered, louder this time. Shh, Alexander whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. Just focus. Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to clear her mind, to remember the stories Dr. Lorraine had shared about past senses, about how they had successfully made contact with spirits. As Dr. Lorraine's chant grew louder, the lights in the room began to flicker again, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Clara closed her eyes, focusing on the darkness, willing herself to remain calm. Is there someone here with us? She asked, her voice trembling. We need your help. At first, there was silence. Then a low, mournful voice seemed to echo through the room, vibrating the floor beneath them. The planchette began to move, slowly at first, then more quickly as if it were drawn by an unseen force. Who are you? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you want? The planchette moved in a slow circle, then stopped. Dr. Lorraine's eyes widened. It's answering, but it's not clear yet. Ask it, Alexander urged, his grip on Clara's hand tightening. What do you want from us? The planchette moved again, spelling out a single word, closure. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Closure? What do you mean? Ask about the child, Dr. Lorraine suggested, her voice tense. Ask about Thomas. Is this about Thomas? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. Are you the child who died here? The planchette moved again, slower this time. Yes. Isabel let out a sharp breath. This is a trick. A mind game. Isabel, this isn't a joke, Alexander said, his voice low and steady. Clara needs answers. As they continued, the planchette moved erratically, tracing circles and back and forth motions. Clara felt a chill in the air, as if the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling. Why are you still here? The planchette moved slowly again, spelling out, lost, lost. Clara repeated, her eyes welling with tears. What does that mean? Ask what he wants, Dr. Lorraine urged, her eyes fixed on the planchette. What do you want? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reunion, the planchette spelled out slowly, the letters flickering in the candlelight. Reunion, Clara whispered, her heart aching. With who? Family, the planchette moved again, the letters almost reluctant in their delivery. Clara, you're connected to him, Dr. Lorraine said softly. There's something here, something that's been holding onto this child's spirit. It needs to find peace. Isabel's eyes widened, her skepticism fading as she watched the planchette move. This is real, isn't it? Yes, Dr. Lorraine replied, her voice steady. This spirit, it's looking for a way to move on, to find peace. As the sayings continued, Clara felt a pressure building in her head, as if the air itself were vibrating with energy. The room seemed to grow darker, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Do you want us to help you? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved in rapid circles, then stopped abruptly. Yes, it spelled out. Then tell us what we need to do, Clara said, her voice steady, though she felt her grip on the planchette slipping. The planchette moved again, tracing out a series of numbers and letters. The house. Cleanse it. You must find the source of the disturbance. Where do we start? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Old room. Under the stairs. The planchette spelled out slowly, its movements jerky as if the force guiding it was growing weaker. Clara nodded, her heart pounding. We'll find it. We'll do whatever it takes. As the seance came to an end, the planchette slipped from Clara's hands and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The room seemed to return to normal, the tension in the air easing slightly. Clara looked around, her eyes wide. Did that really happen? Yes, Dr. Lorraine said, her voice firm. But it's not over. This is just the beginning. We have to go to the old room. We have to find what's been buried for so long. Isabel, Alexander began, but Isabel cut him off, her face pale. I'm not going anywhere near that place. It's the only way, Dr. Lorraine said. If we don't, the spirit will never find peace. And neither will you. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Alexander's. We have to do this, for the child, for Thomas. Alexander nodded, his expression determined. We'll go tonight. As night fell, Clara led the way through the house, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Alexander followed closely behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they descended into the basement. Isabel lagged behind, her expression tight with fear. This is a terrible idea, she muttered, her voice barely audible. We should just call in professionals. Trust me, Clara said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We have to do this ourselves. The basement was a labyrinth of old boxes and discarded furniture. As they reached the narrow staircase that led to the old room, Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking to the shadows that seemed to close in around them. This is it, she whispered. Be careful, Clara, Alexander said, his voice low. This place, it doesn't feel right. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing against the cool stone wall as they made their way up. The old door at the top of the stairs creaked as they pushed it open, the hinges groaning with the effort. The room beyond was small, cluttered with old furniture covered in dust sheets. Clara approached the center of the room, where an old table had been pushed against the wall. This must be where they kept everything, she said, her voice echoing in the silence. As Clara began to search through the debris, Alexander and Isabel kept watch, their eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. Clara's hands shook as she lifted the dust cover from an old bookshelf, revealing rows of ancient books and journals. Isabel, can you help me move this table? She asked, her voice tense. Isabel hesitated, then nodded, stepping forward to push the heavy piece of furniture aside. Beneath it, they found a trapdoor, its latch covered in dust and cobwebs. Clara, are you sure about this? Alexander asked, his flashlight shining down on the old door. This could be dangerous. I have to know. Clara replied, her voice resolute. There's something here, something that's been hidden for so long. She reached for the latch and pushed, the door creaking open to reveal a narrow staircase leading deeper into the darkness. Let's go, she said, her heart racing. This is where the spirit wants us to go. As they descended into the unknown, the air grew colder, the scent of mildew and dust thick around them. Isabel's breath came in short, shallow gasps. I don't like this, she said, her voice trembling. Neither do I, Clara admitted, her grip tightening on the flashlight. But we have to find out what's down here. The stairs ended in a small, candle-lit room. Old crates and jars lined the walls, their labels faded and illegible. Clara's eyes scanned the space, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. Look at this, Alexander said, pointing to a faded tapestry hanging on the wall. Clara approached, her fingers brushing against the fabric as she examined it closely. The design was intricate, but the colors had long since faded to dull grays and blues. "Isabel, help me move this tapestry," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Isabel hesitated, then joined her in carefully pulling it aside, revealing a hidden compartment built into the wall. Inside the compartment was a collection of objects, charms, trinkets, and an old photo in a tarnished frame. Clara picked up the photo, her breath catching as she looked at the familiar faces staring back at her. Thomas and his parents, a young family caught in a moment of happiness. "Who are they?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This is the family," Clara said, her voice cracking. "The ones who lived here before the tragedy." "Is there anything else?" Alexander asked, his voice tense as he peered into the compartment. Clara reached further back, her fingers brushing something cold and metallic. She pulled out a small gold locket, its chain tangled with a piece of yellowed ribbon. "This was his," Clara said, her voice trembling as she held the locket up to the light. "Thomas's mother gave this to him." Isabel took a step back, her eyes wide with realization. "So it's true. There's a connection." "We're not alone here, Clara," Alexander said softly. "This place, it's been waiting for us." As they returned to the main part of the basement, the lights began to flicker again, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Clara felt the cold breeze brush past her, even though there were no windows in the room. "Clara, maybe we should go," Alexander said, his voice low and urgent. This isn't just about the past anymore." "Wait," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "There's something else." Isabel took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked around. "What do you mean?" "Listen," Clara said, her voice almost a whisper. "Can you hear it?" For a moment, the only sound was their breathing. Then a soft, mournful wail echoed through the basement, growing louder with each passing second. "Clara, what is that?" Alexander asked, his voice trembling. "I think," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper. "I think it's Thomas." The wail grew louder, more insistent, and the lights above flickered one final time before going out altogether, plunging them into darkness. As the darkness enveloped them, Clara felt a wave of panic rising in her chest. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," Alexander said, his grip on her hand tightening. "We'll find a way out." Isabel remained silent, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't worth it. We have to find a way to finish this," Clara insisted, her voice steady despite the fear. "We have to help him find peace." Alexander nodded, his flashlight flickering back on. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady. "We'll find the stairs." As they moved slowly through the darkness, Clara's mind raced with questions. What had they unleashed? What was waiting for them in the shadows? And how could they help a lost child find peace? Clara led the way back through the basement, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as they moved cautiously. The basement seemed to close in around them, the air thick with tension. Alexander and Isabel followed, both silent, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "Where do we even start?" Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to find answers," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the fear that clung to her every word. "There's something here, something more than just a haunting." Isabel's grip tightened on her own flashlight. "What if we can't fix this? What if we're just making things worse?" "Then we find another way," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the shadows at the end of the basement. "There has to be a way to help him." The three of them made their way to the far corner of the basement, where an old, weathered bookcase stood against the wall. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against the dusty spine of an old volume. She pulled the book free and opened it to find a collection of handwritten notes and sketches, the pages filled with strange symbols and phrases in a language she didn't recognize. This isn't just a normal haunting, Clara said, her voice growing more confident as she flipped through the pages. This is something older, something darker. Do you understand any of it? Alexander asked, his brow furrowed as he leaned closer to read. Not really, Clara admitted, shaking her head. But maybe there's someone who does. The room fell silent as Clara gathered the pages into a neat pile. She knew they needed to find someone who could decipher these notes, someone who had knowledge of the supernatural, someone who could help them understand what was happening. There's an old man who lives near the forest, Clara said finally, her voice low. He's known for his strange books and herbs. I've heard he knows more than he lets on. Are you serious? Isabel asked, her skepticism clear in her voice. You want to go to some crazy old man in the middle of nowhere? I don't care what people say about him, Clara replied, determination filling her voice. He's our best shot at finding answers. Okay, then let's go, Alexander said, his expression firm. But we need to be careful. We don't know what we're getting ourselves into. As they made their way through the dense woods, the sunlight grew dimmer, the trees pressing close around them. Clara led the way, her sense of direction guided by the old man's description of his home. Isabel walked behind her, occasionally glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. This place gives me the creeps, Isabel muttered, her eyes darting to a rustle in the bushes nearby. Just keep moving, Clara urged, her voice steady. We're almost there. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at a small, hidden cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years of neglect. Clara approached the door and knocked softly. An old voice called from inside. Who's there? Clara, she replied, her voice clear. We need your help. The door creaked open, revealing a frail, elderly man with a long white beard. Clara, he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over. You've brought others with you? These are my friends, Clara explained quickly. We need your help with something unusual. The old man studied them for a long moment, his gaze shifting from one to the other. Come inside, he said finally, stepping back to let them pass. I've been expecting you. Inside, the cabin was filled with strange objects. Jars of herbs, animal bones, and what looked like ancient manuscripts scattered across the table. The old man motioned for them to sit as he busied himself with lighting a fire in the small hearth. Tell me what you found, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Clara placed the notes on the table, spreading them out for him to see. We found these in the basement, she began, explaining the symbols and the strange language they were written in. The old man examined the pages closely, his fingers tracing the lines of the script. This is dark magic, he murmured, his voice low. Not something you can easily understand without knowledge, or without a price. A price? Alexander asked, his voice sharp. Yes, the old man replied, his eyes narrowing as he looked at them. Every spell, every incantation comes with a cost. Sometimes that cost is more than just a life. Can you help us? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I can, the old man said slowly, his eyes shifting to the locket Clara still held. But it will require something from you, something precious. What do you need? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Tell us and we'll do it. The old man hesitated, his eyes studying her closely. Your bond with this spirit, with Thomas. It's not just a connection, it's a pact. You'll need to understand what that means if you want to help him find peace. Please, Clara said, her voice trembling. Tell us how to break it. First, you must listen, the old man said, his gaze fixed on Clara. You'll need to walk the path that Thomas walked, face the same fears, the same choices. Only then will you truly understand what binds him to this place. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Alexander's. We have to do this, she said, her voice steady despite the terror that tightened her chest. We have to find out what really happened here. Isabel's fingers tightened on her flashlight. And if we can't, we have to try, Clara replied, her voice firm. For Thomas. The old man handed Clara a small vial filled with a glowing liquid. This will guide you, he said. Drink it and it will open the door to his memories. Memories he can't leave behind. What if it doesn't work? Alexander asked, his voice tight with worry. Then you must find another way, the old man replied. But remember, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. Clara took the vial, her fingers trembling as she brought it to her lips. Here goes nothing, she murmured, closing her eyes as she drank the liquid. Almost immediately, a sensation washed over her, an overwhelming sense of vertigo, as if the room was spinning around her. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cabin. Clara stood in the middle of a familiar street, the air cold and damp around her. She could see the old bookstore ahead, its windows darkened with dust. This was the place, the one where Thomas had disappeared. As she moved forward, the scene shifted, taking on a dreamlike quality. People passed by without seeing her, their faces expressions of confusion and fear. Clara's heart edged as she looked at the faces of the people who had once been Thomas's friends and neighbors. Clara! Alexander's voice came from behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Where are we? I'm inside his memory, Clara replied, her voice steady as she looked around. We have to find out what happened. They walked through the streets of the town, following the shadow of Thomas as he made his way to the bookstore. Clara could feel the tension in his movements, the uncertainty in his eyes. Clara, we need to find out more, Alexander said softly. Look for something, anything, that will help us understand. Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the buildings as they passed. They reached the bookstore, the door still ajar as if waiting for them to enter. This is it, Clara said, her voice low. As they stepped inside, the air grew heavy, a sense of foreboding settling over them. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as they searched the shelves, their fingers brushing against the spines of books that seemed to whisper secrets in the dark. Here, Alexander said finally, pulling a small, tattered journal from the shelf. This must be his. Clara took the journal, her fingers trembling as she opened it to the last entry. This is the night he disappeared, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He was looking for something, something hidden. Can we find it? Isabel asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. We have to, Clara replied, determination filling her voice. For him. Clara's fingers traced the lines of Thomas's handwriting, each word a silent plea from beyond the grave. She could feel the weight of his fear, the uncertainty that had driven him to seek answers in the dark corners of the town. Alexander leaned in, his eyes scanning over her shoulder. What is it? He asked softly, his voice barely audible in the dim light of the bookstore. It's a list, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Places he visited, things he discovered. Maybe it's a clue to where he's hidden something, Isabel said, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for signs of movement. Or where he's trapped, Clara added, her gaze shifting to the window, as if expecting Thomas himself appear outside. They flipped through the pages, each entry more cryptic than the last. The journal was filled with references to forgotten alleyways, abandoned buildings, and locations that seemed to have been erased from the town's memory. Do you think he was looking for something specific? Alexander asked, his voice tense. I don't know. Clara admitted, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of the notes. But it's clear he was chasing something that wouldn't let him go. As she turned the final page, a photograph slipped from the binding, fluttering to the floor at her feet. Clara bent to pick it up, her breath catching as she saw Thomas's face staring back at her, young, hopeful, and filled with a kind of desperation that seemed out of place in such a simple picture. Is that? Isabel began, her voice catching. It's him, Clara said softly, her fingers brushing over the image as if she could somehow reach into it and bring him back. But why did he have this? Maybe it's a sign, Alexander suggested, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the photograph. A message from him, Or a warning, Isabel added, her voice tinged with fear. What if we're in danger too? Then we find out the truth. Clara replied, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. We have to know what happened. Clara tucked the photograph into her pocket and closed the journal carefully. Let's follow his path, she said, her voice firm. Start with the first place on the list. The first location was an old boarded-up warehouse on the edge of town. The windows were cracked and the door hung off its hinges, as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. As they approached, Clara could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the sense of loss that seemed to cling to the air. Do you think this is where he found something? Alexander asked, his voice low as they stepped inside. It's one of the places he mentioned, Clara replied, her eyes scanning the dusty interior. Let's look around. Isabel stayed close to the door, her eyes constantly moving, watching for any signs of movement. I don't like this, she muttered, her fingers tightening on her flashlight. Neither do I, Clara admitted, her gaze shifting to a set of stairs that led up to the second floor. But we need to go deeper. There might be something up there. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath their weight. The second floor was just as abandoned as the first, filled with old furniture covered in dust and stacks of forgotten boxes. What are we looking for? Alexander asked, his voice echoing in the stillness. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes scanning the piles of boxes. But we'll know it when we see it. They moved through the rooms, each one a little more unsettling than the last. Clara's fingers traced the outlines of the furniture as they passed, her heart racing as she tried to find any clue that might lead them closer to the truth. Look at this, Isabel said suddenly, her voice low, her flashlight fixed on a small metal box hidden in the corner of one of the rooms. What do you think's inside? Clara moved closer, her hand reaching out to open the box. As the lid lifted, the air grew colder, a wave of something almost palpable filling the room. Inside the box was a collection of old photographs. Pictures of Thomas with friends and family, each one showing a different side of his life. His past, Clara said softly, her voice breaking as she picked up one of the photos. Before everything went wrong. Is this why he left? Alexander asked, his voice tight with emotion. It has to be, Clara replied, her eyes scanning the photos as if she could somehow bring him back from the past. He was running from something he couldn't leave behind. Or someone, Isabel suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Look at this, Clara said, her voice catching as she pulled out a particularly worn photograph. A picture of Thomas and a woman she didn't recognize. Who is this? Isabel leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photo. That looks like the old librarian from the town. She used to be Thomas's teacher. Maybe she knows something, Clara said, her voice growing more urgent. We should talk to her. The old librarian's house was just outside of town, a small, neat cottage tucked into the woods. Clara knocked on the door, her heart pounding as she waited for someone to answer. Clara, a voice called from inside. Is that you? Clara turned to see the librarian, Mrs. Hastings, stepping out from behind the door. Her hair was silver, her face lined with age, but there was still something familiar in her eyes. Yes, it's me, Clara said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. We need to talk to you. About Thomas. Mrs. Hastings's expression grew serious as she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. Come inside, she said, her voice low. I was hoping you would come. As they sat around the small table in her living room, Mrs. Hastings's eyes fixed on Clara. Thomas was a troubled boy, she began slowly, her voice steady. He was always curious, always digging into things he shouldn't. Did he ever talk to you about what happened? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hastings hesitated for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. He came to me with questions. Questions about things he didn't understand. He was looking for something hidden in the past. Did he find it? Alexander asked, his voice urgent. Mrs. Hastings's eyes grew distant as if she were seeing something no one else could. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He was on the right track, but he never finished. What was he looking for? Clara pressed, her voice steady as she leaned forward. Clara, some things are better left buried, Mrs. Hastings said softly, her eyes fixed on the floor. But if you're determined to find out, you need to be ready for what you might find. What do you mean? Isabel asked, her voice growing more anxious. The past is full of secrets. Dark, twisted secrets, Mrs. Hastings replied, her eyes meeting Clara's. You're close, but there's something you're not seeing, something you're missing. Can you tell us what it is? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Mrs. Hastings shook her head. No, Clara, you have to find it for yourself. It's the only way to understand. Thank you, Clara said softly, standing from the table. We'll keep looking. Be careful, Mrs. Hastings called as they left, her voice filled with a warning Clara couldn't quite place. As they made their way back to town, the feeling of unease grew stronger with every step. Clara could feel the darkness closing in around her, an invisible force that seemed to be guiding them through the clues, leading them toward the truth. This isn't just about Thomas anymore, Alexander said as they walked, his voice low. We're dealing with something much bigger. Something that's been buried for a long time, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. We have to find it before it's too late. They returned to the basement, the weight of their journey pressing down on them. Clara could feel the energy of the place, thick and oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching. What do we do now? Isabel asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the symbols on the wall. Now, Clara said softly, her fingers tracing the symbols as she studied them. Now we unlock the door to the past. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the symbols as if waiting for the right moment to push them into place. The air grew cold and the symbols began to glow faintly, illuminating the room with an eerie light. Do it, Alexander urged, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever this is, it's the key. Clara took a deep breath and pressed her fingers against the symbols, feeling them shift beneath her touch. There was a low hum, and then the air grew still, so still that Clara could almost hear the sound of her own heartbeat. What did you just do? Isabel asked, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know, Clara admitted, her voice trembling as she looked at the symbols. But I think it's going to show us something important. Clara took a step back, her eyes fixed on the symbols that still glowed faintly on the wall. Alexander moved to her side, his hand finding hers as he squeezed gently. What do you think it's going to show us? He asked, his voice low and steady. I don't know, Clara replied, her voice trembling. But we have to find out. Isabel hovered in the doorway, her flashlight bouncing nervously as she looked from the symbols to the walls, to Clara. What if this isn't safe? She'd asked, her voice catching. What if we're getting in over our heads? Maybe we are, Clara said, her eyes still on the symbols. But if there's a chance it can tell us what happened, what Thomas found, then we have to take it. Clara took a deep breath and stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the symbols one last time. As she did, the symbols glowed brighter, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with an energy that Clara could feel in her bones. Are you sure about this? Alexander asked, his voice full of doubt. Yes, Clara said softly, her eyes fixed on the symbols. We need to know the truth. As she pressed her hand against the final symbol, there was a low rumble, and then the entire wall seemed to slide open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. Clara's breath caught as she looked into the darkness beyond. It's down there, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Alexander stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. We should go, he said, his voice firm. But be ready. It could be dangerous. Clara nodded, her hand tightening on his as they stepped into the passageway. The air grew colder as they moved forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. What do you think we'll find? Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper as they turned a corner. I don't know, Clara replied, her voice steady. But we have to keep going. The passageway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around them as they descended deeper into the earth. Every few feet, they would find another set of symbols etched into the stone, each one glowing faintly as if guiding their way. We're close, Clara said, her voice low as they reached the end of the passage. The last set of symbols was more complex than the others, a series of interlocking shapes that seemed to move as if alive. Do you know what it means? Alexander asked, his eyes fixed on the symbols. Think it's a map, Clara replied, her fingers tracing the shapes. It's showing us something, maybe the way to find whatever Thomas was looking for. As she touched the final symbol, there was a flash of light, and then the ground beneath them seemed to open up. Clara gasped as the passageway gave way, dropping them into a hidden chamber below. Are you okay? Alexander asked, his voice tense as they climbed to their feet. I'm fine, Clara replied, brushing the dust from her clothes. But where are we? The chamber was large and cold, the walls covered in a layer of frost that seemed to glisten in the dim light. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on the pedestal was a box. Wooden and old, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to pulse with energy. What is it? Isabel asked, her voice trembling as she approached the pedestal. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the box. But I think this is what Thomas was after. Do you think it's dangerous? Alexander asked, his voice low. I don't know, Clara said, her fingers reaching out to touch the box. As she did, the carvings began to glow, and the box lifted slightly from the pedestal as if pulled by an unseen force. What do you think it wants? Isabel asked, her flashlight bouncing nervously in the shadows. I think it wants us to open it, Clara said softly, her voice trembling. But we need to be careful. With a deep breath, Clara lifted the box from the pedestal, her fingers trembling as she held it in her hands. As soon as she touched it, there was a low hum, and then the air in the chamber seemed to grow still. Clara, what's happening? Alexander asked, his voice full of concern. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the box. But I think we're about to find out. The carvings on the box began to glow brighter, and then they seemed to lift from the surface, forming a shape that seemed to hover in the air. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the shape, and then suddenly everything went black. Clara felt herself falling into a darkness that seemed endless. There was no sense of direction, no way to know where she was or what was happening. She reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. Clara, a voice called, familiar and distant at the same time. Can you hear me? Yes, Clara replied, her voice trembling. Who is this? It's Thomas, the voice said, softer this time. I need you to listen. There's something you need to know. Thomas, where are you? Clara asked, her heart pounding. What's going on? I'm trapped, he said, his voice filled with fear. But I've found a way. If you follow the path, you can find me. What do you mean? Clara asked, her eyes darting around in the darkness. There's a door, Thomas replied, his voice growing stronger. A door that leads to the past, my past. You have to go through it, Clara. It's the only way to save me. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest. But how do I find it? She asked, her voice breaking. You already have, Thomas said. The symbols, they're the key. Follow them, follow the path, and you'll find the door. I don't understand, Clara said, her voice rising in panic. What do I do? Believe in yourself, Thomas said, his voice growing fainter. And don't let go of hope. Wait. Thomas, Clara called, but there was only silence. Suddenly, she was back in the chamber, the box still in her hands, its carvings glowing faintly. Alexander and Isabel were kneeling beside her, their faces filled with concern. Clara, are you okay? Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. I think I saw him, Clara replied, her voice trembling. I saw Thomas, he was calling to me. Did you find what he was looking for? Isabel asked, her eyes wide with fear. I think I did, Clara said softly, her fingers tracing the carvings on the box. But it's not over, there's still so much we don't know. We're not done yet, Alexander said, his voice steady. We're close, Clara. We just need to keep going. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. We have to find the door, she said, her voice firm. The one Thomas was talking about. Do you think it's really in the past? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the box. But if it is, then that's where we need to go. They left the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the cold passageway. As they made their way back to the surface, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them. Do you think we're in danger? Alexander asked, his voice low. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes scanning the shadows. But we can't stop. We can't turn back now. As they reached the surface, the world outside seemed darker, the air thick with the weight of their journey. Clara could feel the energy of the town, the secrets it held, the darkness that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. Let's go, she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear. We have to find that door. Isabel hesitated, her eyes fixed on the horizon. What if we can't? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Then we'll make sure Thomas's story isn't lost, Clara replied, her voice steady. We'll make sure his secrets don't disappear. They started to walk, their footsteps slow and deliberate as they made their way back to town. Clara could feel the weight of their past and their future pushing down on her with every step. Where do we start? Alexander asked, his voice steady as he looked at Clara. Wherever the symbols lead us, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Wherever they take us. No matter how dark it gets. As they walked into the night, the weight of their journey seemed to press down on them. An invisible force that kept them moving forward, even when they didn't know where they were going. We'll find him, Clara, Alexander said softly, his voice filled with determination. We'll find Thomas and bring him back. Or we'll uncover the truth, Clara replied, her voice steady. And that's all that matters. With that, they stepped into the darkness, the weight of their past and their future guiding them toward the door that would unlock the secrets of the past, and maybe save them all. Clara felt the weight of her words hanging in the air as they walked into the darkness. The town seemed to close in around them, the streets empty except for the occasional flicker of light from a far-off street lamp. The wind blew through the alleyways, and for a moment it felt like they were completely alone in the world. Where do we go from here? Isabel asked, her voice barely audible as they turned a corner. Clara looked around, her eyes scanning the buildings as if trying to find a clue. I don't know, she said finally. But we have to keep moving. We have to find the door. Alexander put his hand on Clara's shoulder, his eyes steady. We will, he said softly. But we need to be careful. We don't know what's out here. Clara nodded, feeling the tension in her muscles as they made their way through the darkened streets. The town was silent, the only sound the occasional scurry of a rat or the distant howl of a dog. It was like stepping into a different world, one where the rules didn't apply and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Look, Isabel said suddenly, her voice full of urgency. She pointed to a narrow alleyway between two buildings. There, do you see it? Clara followed her gaze, her heart skipping a beat as she saw a faint outline, a door carved into the side of one building, its wood old and weathered, as if it had been there for centuries. That's it, Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. That's the door. They moved toward it slowly, each step deliberate, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. When they reached the door, Clara hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the rough wood. Are you sure this is it? Alexander asked, his voice low. I think so, Clara replied, her fingers brushing the carvings on the door. It feels right. Isabel moved closer, her flashlight sweeping over the door as if searching for something hidden. There's a lock, she said, her voice tense. But it's old, rusted. Maybe there's another way in, Clara said, her eyes scanning the ground around the door. A way to get inside without having to pick the lock. Look, Alexander said suddenly, his voice low. There's a key right there. Clara looked where he was pointing and saw a small, intricately carved key lying on the ground at the base of the door. It was old, covered in a layer of dust, but Clara could see the familiar symbols etched into its surface. That's it, she said, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. This is the key. Be careful, Alexander said, his voice full of concern as she moved to the lock. Clara took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, and with a slow turn, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the earth. Are you ready? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Alexander took her hand, his grip tight. As ready as I'll ever be, he said. Isabel followed them down the stairs, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stairs seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. Clara could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her as they descended deeper and deeper into the unknown. Where do you think this leads? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. For the past, Clara replied softly. To whatever Thomas found, the secret he was hiding. Do you think he's down there? Alexander asked, his voice full of doubt. I don't know, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. But we have to find out. They reached the bottom of the stairs, a heavy wooden door standing before them. It was old, its wood covered in carvings that seemed to pulse with energy. Clara took a deep breath and reached for the handle. This is it, she said, her voice steady. The door to the past. Isabel moved closer, her flashlight casting a shadow on the door. Do you think it's safe? She asked, her voice full of fear. No, Clara replied, her fingers trembling as she pushed the door open. But we have to keep going. We have to find the truth. The door creaked as it swung open, and Clara stepped into the darkness beyond. Alexander and Isabel followed, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they moved deeper into the unknown. What do you think we'll find? Alexander asked, his voice low. Answers, Clara replied softly. And maybe something we weren't expecting. The passageway seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in around them as they moved forward. Every few feet, Clara would find another set of symbols carved into the stone, each one glowing faintly as if guiding their way. Do you think we're close? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. I hope so, Clara replied, her fingers tracing the symbols as they moved past. As they reached the end of the passageway, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. Clara could feel it in her bones, the energy of the place, something that seemed to pull at her, calling her forward. Clara, Alexander said suddenly, his voice full of urgency. Look, there's a door, right there. Clara turned and saw it, a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to move as if alive. She took a deep breath and reached for the handle. This is it, she said, her voice steady. The final door, the one that leads to the past. Are you sure? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. I think so, Clara replied, her fingers closing around the handle. But we won't know until we open it. She turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in a soft, eerie light. The walls were covered in the same symbols that had led them here, and in the center of the room was a pedestal, an ancient artifact sitting atop it, glowing with an otherworldly energy. What is that? Alexander asked, his voice low as they stepped into the room. I don't know, Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the artifact. But I think it's what Thomas was looking for, the key to everything. As they moved closer, the air seemed to grow still, and Clara felt a sense of peace, a calm that seemed to fill the room. She reached out and touched the artifact, her fingers trembling as she felt the energy course through her. "This is it," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "This is what we've been looking for. Do you think it's safe to take it?" Isabel asked, her voice full of doubt. "I don't know," Clara replied, her eyes fixed on the artifact. "But we have to, it's the only way to find out what Thomas knew." She took a deep breath and lifted the artifact from the pedestal. As she did, there was a flash of light and then everything went black. Clara felt herself falling into the darkness of her own mind. The room around her seemed to blur, and then she was standing in a different place, one that felt familiar but strange at the same time. "Clara," a voice called, familiar and distant at the same time. It was Thomas, his voice filled with urgency. "Clara, you have to listen. There's something you need to know." Clara turned and saw him, standing at the edge of a cliff, his face filled with fear. "Thomas," she called, her voice breaking. "Where are you?" "I'm trapped," he said, his voice full of panic. "But I've found a way. If you follow the path, you can find me." "Thomas, what do I do?" Clara asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "There's a door," he said, his voice growing fainter. "A door that leads to the past, my past. You have to go through it, Clara. It's the only way to save me." "But how do I find it?" Clara asked, her eyes darting around in the darkness. "You already have," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "The symbols. They're the key. Follow them, follow the path, and you'll find the door." "I don't understand," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Believe in yourself," he said softly. "And don't let go of hope." With that he was gone, and Clara was left alone in the darkness. She could feel the weight of his words, the weight of his fear, and knew that she had to keep going, that she had to find the door. As she walked, the symbols seemed to appear before her, glowing faintly as if guiding her steps. Clara followed them, her heart pounding with each step, until she reached a heavy wooden door. It was the same door she had seen in the darkness. Thomas's door, the one that led to the past. Clara took a deep breath and reached for the handle. This was it, her final chance to save Thomas, to uncover the truth. She pushed the door open, her heart in her throat, and stepped into the darkness beyond. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, and Clara found herself in a different time, a different place. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the walls were covered in the same symbols she had seen before. "Clara," a voice called, familiar and distant at the same time. It was Thomas, his voice filled with urgency. "You have to hurry. They're coming for us." Clara ran, following the sound of his voice, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the energy around her, the power of the past, and knew that she was on the right path. As she reached the end of the passageway, she saw Thomas standing at the edge of a cliff, his eyes filled with fear. "Clara," he said, his voice breaking. "You have to get out of here. There's no time." "Thomas, what's happening?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I could change things, make everything right, but I was wrong. It's not that simple." "Thomas, what do I do?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "Follow the path," he said, his voice full of urgency. "The symbols, they're the key. Follow them and you'll find the door that leads back to your time." Clara nodded, her heart breaking as she looked at him. "I will," she said softly. "I promise. Don't forget. Hope is the key," he said, his voice growing fainter. "Believe in yourself, Clara. Believe that you can find the way back." And with that he was gone, and Clara was left alone at the edge of the cliff. She took a deep breath and turned, following the path, the symbols glowing faintly as if guiding her steps. As she reached the door, Clara could feel the energy around her, the power of the past, the weight of what she had learned. She reached for the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the light. The world around her seemed to blur, and then she was back in the present, standing in the same place where she had started, at the base of the stairs leading down into the darkness. Alexander and Isabel were there, their faces filled with relief. "Clara," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "You did it, you found the door." Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. "I did," she said softly. "And I found the truth." Isabel moved closer, her eyes filled with tears. "What did you find?" she'd asked, her voice full of fear. "Hope," Clara replied, her voice steady. "The belief that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way back." The three of them stood there, the past and the present colliding in that moment. Clara knew that the door was always there, the key to everything, waiting for someone to find it. As they walked away from the darkness, back into the light, Clara felt a sense of peace, a calm that had been missing for so long. She knew that the journey wasn't over, there would always be more secrets to uncover, more doors to open. But for now she was back, safe in the present, with Alexander and Isabel by her side. And as they walked away, the door behind them slowly began to close, the symbols fading as if they had never been there at all. The story of Clara, Alexander, and Isabel had come to an end, for now. And as they moved forward, they knew that the past was never truly behind them. It was always just a door away,